Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. I am back again with Andrew Loke, and this time we're going to be discussing the Kalam cosmological argument. Recently, Alex Malpass, Graham Oppy, and Joe Schmid have responded to Loke's both his debate and the review that we did together. And this time, Loke's ready to respond back to them. So, Andrew, is there anything you want to say before we get started? Any introductory remarks about the video or anything like that?
Yes, I'd like to say something about why you want to do this video on Kalam, because people might wonder, why do I? Because we already made one previously, right, in response to Oppy, the debate that I had with Oppy, and the reason why I would like to do this episode is because this time round it's not just responding to Oppy, right, but it's also responding to Oppy and his friends, right, Alex Malpass and Joe Schmid, right, and during their review, Malpass and Schmid actually contributed quite a lot, right, to the discussion, right? And so this response is not only a response to Oppy, but also a response to them as well. Now, with regards to Oppy, Cameron told me that he's trying to schedule a follow-up debate with Oppy, right, on the Capturing Christianity channel, right? So yeah, so we'll hopefully that will take place. But in the meantime, I would like to respond not only to Oppy, but also to Malpass and Schmid, right? And when I look at their review, I was a bit disappointed actually, because Malpass and Schmid, they use quite a number of new arguments, which is not found in the debates, but is found on a blog that is set up by Hugh Gideat, right? They use quite a lot of arguments from there, but they did not respond to a number of important responses which I wrote on that blog, right? So it seems that their review is a bit one-sided. I mean, they quote from the blog and make it seem as if they have already repeated me, right? But actually, I also wrote on that blog and responded to the points they raised, but they didn't discuss those points, right? So it makes it looks like a bit one-sided, their review, and this is something that I was a bit disappointed about their review, right? And
did you comment on the blog before they did the video review?
Oh yes, yeah. I commented before and so that's why I would like to do this review again, to highlight some of the points which I think they missed, right, and to help the listeners understand a bit more about what are their objections and also what is wrong with their objections. Right? And another reason why I want to do this is because some of the issues which they raise are new issues. And they're actually quite interesting in their own right. There are some very interesting philosophical issues which they raise, and these issues are not found in the debates. They are not found in the previous interview that we did together, and therefore I think these are worth responding to, right? And that's the reason why I would like to do this session again with you, right? This new session with you, and the last point I would like to make is that I would like to encourage the listeners to listen to our first interview together, because in our first interview we cover a lot of important points about the Kalam, right? And I'm not going to repeat those points again today, right? So for example, points like why I think that there's a first cause, and also responding to misconceptions such as concerning quantum physics and Kalam, right? So those are very, very important points, but we already covered those, right, in our first interview, and so I won't be covering those again today. So I'm not going to repeat them today, so I'll just encourage the listeners to listen to our first interview first before listening to this one.
All right, that sounds good. So you have a PowerPoint ready for us. Do you want to? Is this PowerPoint going to be used throughout the entire discussion, or just when we get to the points?
Yeah. No need. Only at some points. But yeah.
All right. So then, with that being said, do you want to look at the video now with all three of them and discuss the points that we have on the document?
Yeah, we can start with the first point, and you can play the clip, then I'll respond to it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm now going to get the clip out of the debate, or not, excuse me, not the debate, the discussion that Oppy and Malpass and Schmid had. So here we go. Okay, so around 3:20, Oppy kind of reiterates his view on the nature of arguments, and we'll give it a listen. Let me make sure that that my sound is going to share computers. There we go. All right.
to what we're going to argue about is the soundness of arguments, then we've kind of got hold of the wrong end of the stick, because we should be talking about the truth of theories, not the soundness of arguments. The soundness of arguments is a kind of entirely dependent status, right? It would be a different matter if what we were going to talk about was the claim that, you know, the Kalam syllogism proves its conclusion. We could actually have, although it wouldn't be a very long discussion, we could have a discussion about that might serve some purpose. But the making the topic the question about the soundness of the argument seemed to me to have kind of got us off completely on the wrong foot.
All right. So what do you have to say about that, Andrew?
Well, no, he thinks that talking about the soundness of the argument starts us at the wrong foot. And I think what he's trying to say is that on his view, the soundness of arguments are based on his view, the soundness of arguments depends on theories, right? I think that is what he's trying to say with his ground rules. However, my response to his ground rules is that if a theory entails a contradiction, then it cannot be true, right? And this is something that he also admits at some point, right? He says, if you're able to demonstrate some kind of inconsistency with my view, you know, then yeah, that counts against my theory, right? And this is precisely what I try to do, right, with my Modus Tollens argument, because my Modus Tollens argument shows that his theory entails a contradiction, right? So I'm going to explain this point a bit more, right, later on. But what I'm trying to say is that what I'm trying to say is that what I'm trying to do actually fits, right, with his ground rules, right? And so if his theory entails a contradiction, then it cannot be true. Yeah.
I guess one question that I have too is, you know, so if Oppy keeps on saying that theory is prior to arguments, then how exactly do we engage the theory itself now? Because I think, like, wouldn't you need to, like, construct arguments and structured reasoning in order to approach the theory then? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a very good question, right? So let me illustrate with an analogy, right? Suppose now we know that in cosmology, right, in the 20th century, you know, there was two models two theories that were competing with each other, right? So there was the steady state theory of the universe, and then there's a Big Bang theory, right? So they will do this. There are these two theories, right? Now, it will be fallacious for a proponent of the steady state theory to reply to the reasons for the Big Bang theory by saying that, you know, given my steady state theory, your reasons, your arguments for the Big Bang model must be wrong, right? Rather, he or she, the proponent of the steady state theory, will need to rebut those arguments for the Big Bang model, right? If it turns out that the arguments for the Big Bang model are sound, or the arguments are really good arguments, right? Then the steady state model is wrong and should be rejected, right? And it turns out that the prediction, right, of the steady state theory is contradicted by what scientists observe in the cosmic microwave background radiation, right? And so we can formulate predictions, you know, using a kind of Modus Tollens argument, right? So the steady state theory predicts that what you will observe in the cosmic microwave background is a certain kind of distribution, right, of the radiation, right? But premise two, that was not what scientists observed, right? So, you know, it's denying the consequence, right? And therefore, you know, the prediction of steady state model is falsified, right? And that is the reason why most scientists reject the steady state model now. I mean, it's kind of dead, right? Most scientists nowadays accept the Big Bang theory and reject the steady state theory precisely because of arguments, right? Arguments based on evidence, right? And that's how I think we should see the relationship, right, between theory and arguments.
Of course, you know, I think Oppy and the others mentioned that whenever we have these arguments, we need to appeal to some common basis, right, or something shared between us. But then I think Oppy was making the point, or at least the others were making the point, that like how the argument was structured. I remember they said like the premises are too close to the conclusion, or they you know, they said all these sorts of things to suggest that Andrew, you didn't attempt to find something common between you and Oppy. But obviously in our discussion and even last time in our review, that isn't the case. And even in your debate with Oppy, you tried to show, based on the Modus Tollens argument, that there are some common, let's say, premises or things that you have to recognize as consequences that are unacceptable on Oppy's view.
Yes, that's right. But even if there's no commonality, right, as long as the reasons which I gave are true, that entails that his view is false, right? It's just like the analogy I gave just now, right, concerning the Big Bang theory and the steady state theory, right? I mean, these two models are very different, right? They might not have things in common. I mean, even if they don't have any things in common, but as long as, right, the proponent of the Big Bang theory is able to formulate an argument based on premises which are true, right, based on observation, for example, right, the observation of CMB, for example, right. So if the argument for the Big Bang theory is well grounded, then that just falsify the and that just lead to the acceptance of the Big Bang theory, and the steady state theory should be rejected, right, if it is contrary to observation, for example, right. So so at the end of the day, right, it is the main what really matters, right. It's not really do I have to share any common ground with him or not, right? But rather whether my grounds correspond with reality or not, and whether his grounds resulted in a contradiction or not, right? So and so this is how we should think about the dialectic.
Right. So like if you have two theories that are like have equal explanatory scope. So for instance, I mean, his theory to some extent can explain all the data by just saying the initial state's necessary and it had a beginning. Whereas, you have your theory, Andrew. And the idea is that even if, let's say, they have equal explanatory scope and there's no kind of maybe common ground, right? Because they both equally explain with two kind of contradictory ideas, right? So like his idea and your idea are mutually exclusive, right? But they both all explain the data. Then my question is, okay, why should I accept one over the other? And I think what you've done, especially with the arguments that you pointed out from physics and so on, is that there are more reasons to accept your conclusion or idea than his, right? Because even if they are both equal in explanatory scope, that doesn't necessarily mean that, let's say, one is more powerful than the other, or that they're equally powerful, right? That power has to be determined by reasons.
Exactly, yeah. The power has to be determined by reasons, right? And I explained during the debate and also during our first interview that the three reasons I gave, right? The first two reasons are analytically true, right? The first two reasons are true by definition, right? And so they are true, right? They're necessarily true, actually, the first two reasons, right? And the third reason is based on observation, right? And so which we know to be true as well, right? So those three reasons are true, right? And so they entail that his view is false, right? Remember, right, during the debates, he said that given my view, Oppy said that given my view, your three reasons must be false, right? And to which I replied, given my three reasons, your view is false. So it's very important to pay attention to this point because we are not talking past each other, right? I think Joe Schmid said that we are talking past each other, but actually we are not, right? We are talking about the same thing, right? We are talking about his view and my reasons. They have entailment relationship, right? One entail that the other is false, right? And so we are talking about the same thing. So it's not that we are talking past each other. Rather, the key issue is whether my reasons are true or not. Right? How well grounded are my reasons, right? And I already explained that my reasons are well grounded because they are the first two reasons, as I said, they are necessarily true, right? So, and then the third reason is true by observation. It's grounded on observation, and therefore these three reasons are true, right? And that entails that his view is false. It's just like, as I said just now, right? When we compare the steady state theory and the Big Bang theory, right? The Big Bang theory, is supported by the observation of the cosmic microwave background radiation, whereas the steady state theory is contradicted by the observation, right? So given that this is the case, a proponent of the steady state theory cannot just say, oh, well, given my theory, given your observation must be false. I mean, that will be like stomping your foot, right? Foot stomping, right? I just want to insist that my view is true and yours is false. You're begging the question, right? And stomping your feet, right? That would be so unreasonable, right? That would be, it's kind of stubbornness, right? And so that shouldn't be the way how OP respond, right? But I remember that the way OP respond, right, makes me reminds me of the debate that he had with Robert Kuhns, where there's one point which OP said that my view might sound like question begging, and Robert Kuhns say, well, worse, your view sounds like foot stomping. Right? It's just, oh, like my view, and your reason that seems to be the kind of reaction that he has in response to my reasons, and that is just unreasonable, right? And so I want to say that given my reasons, his view is false. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was actually the second thing that we're going to talk about, but because I kept on asking questions, we kind of, we didn't get to see the clip of later. Oppy reiterates that point about the 3 reasons. But anyway, let's get back on track now. So we are going to look at Joe Schmid talking about whether or not Loke's Modus Tollens is exhaustive. So here's the context from the video.
I guess the next thing we might want to touch on is this demand for the special property and whether or not it needs to be a property of the initial segment, and whether or not it could instead be just maybe a global property about the space of possible worlds, say, at least speaking loosely in terms of property, right? So I guess I'm not sure why that in virtue of which the initial thing, rather than other logically possible initial things, or rather than other non-initial things coming to being uncaused, I'm not sure why this sort of grounding, this metaphysical grounding that Loke talks about, I'm not sure why it would need to be a special property of the initial item, or I'm not sure why it would need to be a special property or some kind of cause that delimits it. I think that there might be other options, which Graham was really, I think, gesturing towards in the discussion, but it could have been clarified further. And the other options would be, well, what about the space of possible worlds, or maybe a metaphysical principle that Oppy employs, right, when he talks about having his 2 principles, that everything has an explanation and all non-initial things have causes, right? Those 2 principles can do the requisite explanatory work here, it seems to me. They can be that in virtue of which the initial thing and not other initial things, or and so on, why that can obtain with the beginning uncaused rather than other things. And also, the space of possible worlds, right? We can just appeal to metaphysical necessity to do the requisite explanatory work, it seems. So I'm not quite sure why the kind of conditions that Loke lays out, namely a kind of special property or a cause that kind of delimits it, or the circumstances being incompatible with it, I'm not sure why those would be exhaustive. Why can't we appeal to the space of possible worlds, metaphysical principles, and other sorts of things?
All right, so for the audience, Andrew, can you explain first Joe's objection and then get into your response?
Sure. So Joe raised a very good question here, actually. Right? So Joe asks, why think that these 3 reasons are exhaustive, right? And this is a very good question. In fact, I had prepared a response for the debate with OP. I have actually come up with a syllogism, right, which proved that other than brute fact, which OP cannot claim, I'll explain this later, the 3 reasons are exhaustive based on the syllogism, right? Now, I didn't show this during the debate because I think that to go through this in such rigorous detail would take a long time in the debate. But I did prepare it, right? And in fact, I posted it on the blog, on the huge GDX blog. But Joe did not refer to that. Maybe he didn't read that part, right? Where I respond to Landon Hendrick on this particular question. And so let me explain this here then, right? I'm good. And so Swan, can you show the slide?
Yeah, sure. Let me get that out. And here we go.
Yes, the argument for premise 1 of the Modus Tollens arguments. Okay. So in order to answer Joe's Schmid's question, right, we can look at this syllogism. Okay. So premise 1.1. If only X rather than y begins to exist uncaused, then either nothing makes it the case, either it's a brute fact or something makes it the case, like something S makes it the case. Right? In which case, either S is a property of X, which makes it different from Y, right? So S is a special property that X has, but Y does not have, right? Remember, this is reason 2, right, that I presented. Or S is a property of something other than X, either the circumstances of X, which will be like something that makes it the case that X begins, right? So it'll be like a kind of cause of X, right? Which is the reason 1 which I presented, or is the circumstances of Y or Y, right? So this will be the third reason, right, which I presented. Okay. So if we look at this 1.1, we can see that using the laws of logic, right, we can see that there are only these few possibilities, right? So this is logically exhaustive, right? And now take note that this is making reference to concrete entities and their properties, right? Now later on, Joe is going to ask some questions which is related to abstract entities, right? And I'm going to explain later that appealing to abstract entity is irrelevant because abstract entity does not cannot make it the case that X rather than Y happens, right? Because abstract entity doesn't have this kind of power, right? I will talk about this later on, right? But at this point in time, I just want to highlight for the audience, the listeners, that this makes reference to concrete, right? Either nothing concrete makes it the case, or something concrete makes it the case, right? So maybe this something, so S may be part of something concrete, right? A property of so property S, right? Maybe part of something concrete, right? The property of X, which makes it different from Y, right? Either a special property of something concrete, or it is a property of the concrete circumstances, or is part of Y, which is something concrete, right? Okay, so 1.1 is logically exhaustive, and then 1.2 is not the case that is none of the above. Basically, is saying, right? And I'll explain why is none of the above later on, right? And therefore, it follows that it is not the case that only X rather than Y begins to exist uncaused. Okay, so now the key question is, why is it none of the above, right? Why is it that someone cannot claim that it's a brute fact, for example, right? 1.1.1, right? Now, the reason why it cannot be a brute fact is because, remember, Oppy is trying to say that only the initial state of reality, but not other things, begins to exist uncaused, right? Now, this restriction to only the initial state of reality must be grounded in something such as there is a relevant difference between the initial state and later events, for example. Right? One cannot simply say that it is a brute fact, because if there is no relevant difference between the initial state and other things, this will imply that the initial state and other things will be the same where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, right? That is, if there is no relevant, okay, can you show the next slide? Yeah. Right, so this is against the brute fact, right? So yeah, please click on. For if there's no relevant difference between X and Y, this will imply that X and Y are the same where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, right? However, according to Oppy, X and Y are not the same where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, because given that he's claiming that only X but not Y begins uncaused, right? So this is what he said. And therefore, Oppy would require the claim that there is a relevant difference between X and Y. He cannot simply say that it's a brute fact. Okay, so when we look at this argument, you can see that 1.1.1.1, right? This is analytically true, right? This is true by definition, right? If there's no difference, it means that they're the same, right? So 1.1.1.1 is true, and 1.1.1.2 is what he claims, and therefore he would require that there is a relevant difference. He cannot simply say that it's a brute fact. Okay. Okay, go on to the next slide. Now, what about special property S, right? I already explained in my debate that no property S can do the required work, right? We talked about this in our previous discussion, right? the property S would be superfluous. And interestingly, I think Alex Malpass agree with me on this. Right? He on this point on our blog discussion, he says that the property of X and the conjunction of X and its property cannot explain why X exists, right? So he agreed with me on this point, right? So so this point is refuted. This possibility is refuted. Okay, what about the other possibility, right? Can Oppy appeal to the circumstances of X? Now, I explained during the debate that he cannot do that because X is supposed to be uncaused, right? So you cannot appeal to the circumstances that makes it the case that X begins to exist uncaused, right? Because X is supposed to be without any causally antecedent condition that makes it the case that X begins, right? And Oppy also cannot appeal to the circumstances or to the properties that Y would have, which might make the beginning of Y impossible because we know that the circumstances are such that it is possible for Y to begin to exist, right? So what do we mean by Y, right? By Y, I mean, say, later events such as electric field increasing in strength. Now, such events happen frequently, right? As I explained during our previous interview, right? So these events happen often. So we know that these events do happen. They often begin to exist around us. So we cannot claim that the circumstances around us is such that such events don't happen or cannot happen, right? So they cannot appeal to this as well. And therefore, there's nothing else, right? They can appeal to, because as I said, this is logically exhaustive, and the three reasons, right, I've already excluded. The three reasons I already given, the three reasons, and which exclude the other possibilities, and he cannot claim that it's brute fact, and therefore it follows that his claim that only X but not Y begin uncaused is false.
So Andrew, real quick, I wanted to explore kind of the point that you made about the electric fields increasing in strength, because Oppy and company, they do talk about this. So there's a part where they say, well, Oppy, there's two claims made. So Oppy makes one claim, and I think this is later on the docket, but I think we can just explore it a little bit here. So Oppy makes one claim that electric fields and like things like tigers, right, are not the same sort of thing, right? And then he says secondarily that the reason why tigers don't pop into existence is because there's not a tiger-shaped hole in the realm of metaphysical possibilities, or in the space of the world, right? There's not a tiger-shaped hole. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that's right. I responded to this, right, in my book, actually. Now, with regards to the first reason, now he claimed that objects and events are not the same thing. My response is that my argument applies to whatever that has beginning, right? Whatever that is finite in the earlier than direction. Right? So whether is it objects or whether is it events, as long as they have a beginning, right? My argument applies to that, right? So no, he cannot claim that, oh, I'm just talking about objects, right? But I'm telling him that my argument applies not only to objects but to events as well, right? To whatever that has a beginning. Okay. So this is my response to his first point. Now, with regards to the second point, yeah, the tiger-shaped whole thing, right? That is precisely the reason why I appeal to electric fields increasing in strength, because, well, he could claim that there's no space for a tiger to begin to exist around us. He couldn't claim that there's no space for electric field to increase in strength, right? Because electric field increasing in strength doesn't require any additional space, right? The space around us, has all these fields, and they can just increase in strength, right, without requiring any additional space. And therefore, he can't use that kind of objection, right, against what I'm appealing to here.
Yeah, so I want to press on this point a little bit, because so Oppy is going to say.
Let me add one more point.
Sure.
I suddenly recall there's one more point which I want to add, right? The point I want to add is that now Oppy appealing to tigers beginning, right? Now Oppy was thinking about whether that could happen or not, right? And Oppy is saying that, well, it couldn't happen because there is no space for the tiger to begin to exist around us. Mm-hmm. Whereas I am not appealing to possible events, I'm appealing to actual events, right? I'm appealing to electric field increasing around us. And this is something actual, right? This is something that happens often, right? right? Such events do happen around us often, right? And so I'm not appealing to possible events. I'm appealing to actual events, and I'm claiming that there will be no difference between such actual events as electric field increasing in strength, and also the beginning of the initial state of reality. Right? There will be no difference between these two actual events if the initial state of reality begin to exist uncaused according to Oppy's theory, right? I'm arguing that there will be no difference between them where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, right? And therefore, if it is an actual event that the initial state began uncaused, then the actual event of electric field increasing around me would also be uncaused, right? Because there will be no difference between them where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned. But the consequence is obviously not true, right? Electric fields around me, they do not just increase in strength, right, without me having to, say, switch on an electric field generator, right? And therefore, Oppy's theory is false. Okay? So it is very important here to note that I am appealing to actual events, right? I'm appealing to actual events on Oppy's theory. This is important, right? Mm-hmm. Because on Oppy's theory, he has to affirm that not only the initial state of reality begin, he also has to acknowledge that later events such as electric field increase in strength, right? I mean, these are facts, right? So on his theory, these two are actual events, and he has to account for why one is uncaused but not the other, right? But as I said, given my argument, there cannot be any relevant difference, right? And therefore, if on his theory, one actually began uncaused, the other would actually begin uncaused, which is not the case, and that falsifies his theory.
Right, and the electric, just for anyone who didn't watch the first video, what exactly is the electric field example showing or demonstrating here in the argument?
What is it showing? Yeah, as I said earlier on, right? We know that there are such events which happen. These are actual events, right? And Oppy has to acknowledge that, right? Because these are facts. And I'm trying to argue, and I already explained just now that on his theory, he is trying to claim that the initial state of reality began uncaused as an actual event, whereas electric field increase in strength caused, right, as an actual event. That is what his theory is claiming. But as I already said, right, given my reasons, he cannot claim that, right?
Oh, okay. So it's like,
yeah.
All right. So like, it's an example of just the fact that there are things that begin to exist around us that, can't just be uncaused, so to speak.
Not that they can't be uncaused, but they are not uncaused.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. You ready to move on?
Okay, sure. Yeah, okay, so let's move to the next point. Now, because Joe Schmid raised quite a number of interesting points, right? So the first point he raised just now was, how do we know that these three reasons are exhaustive, right? And I already responded to him by using the syllogism, which explains that other than brute fact, right, these three reasons are exhaustive, right? And I already explained why Oppy cannot appeal to brute fact, and I already explained why the three reasons are true, right? So, given which Oppy's theory fails. Now, Joe Schmid suggested another possibility, right? So he says, well, maybe Oppy can appeal to metaphysical principles, right? So, for example, Oppy might claim that it is a principle that the initial state begin uncaused, but everything else other than the initial state have causes, right? So maybe he can appeal to, but maybe Oppy can claim that there's such a principle like that, right? Which explains why the initial state begins uncaused, whereas later events begins caused, right? Now, in response to Schmid's suggestion, the problem with his suggestion is that any such metaphysical principle will have to be abstract, right? A metaphysical principle is not something concrete, right? a metaphysical principle is not something like a house or a building, that is concrete, that exists in the universe as a kind of object, right? It's not like that, right? A metaphysical principle is supposed to be an abstract principle, right? And the problem with abstract objects, if they exist, I mean, there are disputes about whether abstract objects exist or not, right? I'm sure you know about the debate, right, between Platonists and nominalists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it isn't even clear whether abstract entities exist or not, right? But even if they exist, right, these abstract objects, right, they merely, even if they exist, they merely describe relations. So, for example, mathematical relations such as 2 + 2 = 4, right? These are mathematical relations. Logical relations such as if-then, or relations between events, right? Or abstract objects. So either they just describe relations or possibilities, or they are merely exemplifiable by things, right? So, for example, redness is exemplified by red things, right? Now, abstract objects do not make it the case that things, events happen in one way rather than the other. Right? I mean, abstract objects have no causal power and they do not make things happen. They only describe things, right? So they do not metaphysically ground why some events happen but not other. No, they can't do this kind of grounding, right? They only describe. They are just purely descriptive or exemplifiable, right? And therefore, no such principle could make it the case. No such principle could make it the case that only the initial state of reality, rather than other things, begin uncaused. What makes things happen one way or the other, rather than the other, are concrete entities and their properties, not abstract principles. And therefore, and that's the reason why I formulated the syllogism, right, which you showed just now, right? Because as I said earlier on, the syllogism is referring to concrete things or properties of concrete things, right? You cannot just appeal to abstract metaphysical principle because those principles cannot do any such work. At the end of the day, it has to be concrete. Yeah.
Right. So Oppy can't just say a principle, right, and then think that alone is enough, right? Because there has to be at least some background reasons for why we'd even consider the principle in the first place. There we go.
Exactly right. Yes. Now it's interesting that Alex Malpass, in his correspondence with me on Hugh Gideat's blog, right, he also suggested that maybe Oppy can appeal to metaphysical principle, right? So he made a similar suggestion as Joe Schmid, right? And Malpass, he tries to argue that So Malpass gave an example of, say, the Archimedes principle, right? Do you know about the Archimedes principle? I'm sure you studied this during high school, right?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So according to the Archimedes principle, any object, whether totally or partially immersed in a fluid, right, is boiled up by the force that is equal to the weight of the fluid displaced by the object, right? So it's about displacement, right? So why doesn't a ship sink, right? So using Archimedes principle, right, we can calculate how much fluid is displaced, right, by the ship, right? And we can build a ship in such a way that it will displace enough fluid such that it will float, right? So this is a principle about flotation. And then Malpass argues that, so given some actual facts about a concrete entity, right, say for example a ship, right, plus the Archimedes principle, which is abstract, right, the principle is abstract, right, it follows that the ship will float, right, the body will float, right. So Malpass is trying to say that, well, you know, the principle, even though the principle is abstract, it can do some kind of explanatory work, right? So that is what Malpass is trying to argue. Now, my reply is that the principle, the Archimedes principle, merely describe the relation between the ship and the fluid, the object and the fluid, right? It merely describes the relation between the object and the fluid. What makes the object floats are the properties of the fluid and the properties of the object. Right? And the Archimedes principle merely describes the relationship between the object and the fluid. As Edward Pfizer have argued, laws of nature or principles of nature these are mere abstractions, and thus by themselves cannot explain anything. Right? This is what you said just now, right, Swan? Right?
Yeah.
You cannot just appeal to a principle, right? By themselves, they don't explain anything. What exists in the natural order are concrete substances with certain essence, that is properties, and talk of laws of nature is merely a shorthand for the pattern of behavior that these substances, these objects tend to exhibit given those essences, given those properties. Okay? So what this means is that when we use the Archimedes principle, for example, when we use the principle as part of the explanation, we are merely using the principle as a kind of shorthand, right? It's a kind of summary shorthand for the behavior, for the pattern of behavior that concrete things tend to exhibit, given their properties. So what this means is that at the end of the day, the principle or the law of nature is part of the explanation only because of the properties of concrete things, right? This is the key point, right? So by themselves, the principle explain nothing. At the end of the day, it is still the concrete things and their properties which do the job, right? And that is the reason why they cannot just appeal to metaphysical principle, right? To rebut my argument, right? Because in order to metaphysically ground only X, but not Y, begins uncaused, the properties, they must appeal to properties of concrete entities rather than laws of nature or metaphysical principle, right? But I already showed earlier on, using the syllogism, that there are no such properties, right? I already explained earlier on, right? And therefore, Oppy's theory fails.
Right, and I think I remember during the video too, they mentioned, well, or I could see them maybe making this objection where it's like, okay, but look, the God that you are positing is just the product of some deductions, right? So because of your deductive principles, you eventually arrive at this God, right? And these are abstract deductive principles or premises, and then Oppy's going to say, well, look, and my thing is also kind of abstract in a way, right? So it's not, so if it would be a too colloquial fallacy if they said your view therefore is false, right? I think what Oppy was trying to say is there's a symmetry between our views where both of them seem to be in a similar camp, right? And you locate the ultimate explanation in a different place than he does, and he's going to say, what's the symmetry breaker? Why should we accept your explanation over my explanation, right? And then to which you would respond with the Modus Tollens, correct?
Yes, but I think there's more to be said here.
Yeah.
Because Alex Malpass, right, in his correspondence with me, he also say that he also make a kind of tu quoque style objection, right? Because I explained to Alex that he cannot appeal to metaphysical principle, right? Because those principles by themselves explain nothing. But Alex says that, but you too, right? You, Andrew Loke, you also appeal to, don't you also appeal to abstract principle? Like, for example, the causal principle itself, right? That everything that begins to exist as a cause, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, isn't it the case that such a principle is also an abstract principle, right? Now, my response to Alex is that, yes, I do refer to abstract principle, everything that begins to exist as a cause. But this principle is just the consequence of my view that what makes things happen are concrete entities and their properties. Because my view implies that without concrete entities, without concrete causes, for example, doing the work, nothing will begin to exist, right? I mean, if there's no cause, there won't be effect, right? There won't be things beginning, right? Because then this is just the consequence of my view, right? What makes things, what does the work are concrete things. If you take away concrete causes, right? If there are no concrete causes, then nothing would begin to exist. And that is precisely why uncaused events do not happen, right? And that is the reason why everything that begins to exist has a cause. You see what I mean?
Yeah. All right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they can't. So they can't rebut my argument like this. Their tu quoque objection fails. Yeah. Because the principles that appeal to at the end of the day, they are all grounded in concrete entities and their properties.
Right, and you're saying that this is a superior, to use Oppy's language, this is a theoretical virtue, right? That you can ground it in something concrete as opposed to just positing an abstract principle.
Yeah, and I already explained just now that their view actually commits a categorical error, right? Because abstract properties, abstract entities just can't do that kind of work, right? So it's a categorical error to claim that they can do that kind of work, right? Yeah.
All right. Are we still going to use the PowerPoint slides for anything, or
later on? But let me go on and respond to two other points Schmid mentioned. He raised. So Schmid also say that, well, maybe you remember just now you played the clip just now. Schmid says that maybe there's some kind of global property, right? He said that, well, maybe the special property S could be a global property, right? Now my response is that no, it has to be a property that differentiates the initial state of reality from later events, right? You cannot just claim that it's a kind of global property. That is you cannot just claim that, but it has to be specific property that makes the initial state different from later events, because otherwise there'll be no difference between them where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, right? That is my point. That's the point of my argument, and so he cannot just dodge my argument by saying that no, there's some global property, right? That's just dodging my argument. That's not responding to my argument. Now, Oppy, now Schmid also says that maybe Oppy can appeal to space of metaphysical possibilities. Yes, do you remember he said that?
Yeah, I remember.
Okay, now and this point is important because now we need to talk about modality, right? Remember, the issue of modality is quite an important issue that arose in our debate, right? So Oppy was making claims about metaphysical necessity of the initial state of reality. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Okay, so this point deserves a detailed response. Okay, now can you show the slide now?
Yeah, I can. Let me get that up again.
Okay, good. Now, before you go on, I would like to explain for the audience that during the debates, there are actually two different versions of the Modus Tollens argument which I presented. Okay, I don't know whether you noticed that, Swan. No, but actually my Modus Tollens argument actually has two forms. Right? It's not only one form. There are actually two types of Modus Tollens argument which I presented during the debate. Okay, so the first form concerns later events, right? So the first form of Modus Tollens argument is that if the initial state of reality begins uncaused, then later events will also begin uncaused, right? Remember just now we were talking about electric fields increasing in strength?
Yeah, and they don't need space, right?
Yeah, they don't need space, that's right. So that argument concerns events that are later than the beginning of the initial state of reality, right? Those events are events that happen around us now, right? Which is later than the Big Bang or whatever that happened billions of years ago, right? So this is the argument. This is the Modus Tollens argument concerning later events beginning uncaused. Okay. Now there is a second form of arguments which I presented in the debate, and this is the Modus Tollens argument concerning other space-time blocks beginning uncaused initially. Right. So the second form of the argument concerns the initial state. I argue that the initial state could have been very different. Do you remember that? I think we talked about this last time also. That I talked about if our universe begin uncaused, then other universes will also begin uncaused, and they will crush into our universe. They will disrupt the cosmic microwave background radiation. And what we observe on the cosmic microwave background radiation would have been very different if that were the case. Right? Do you vaguely recall that in the debate?
I honestly, there's a lot. So I don't remember, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. Yeah. Okay, but my point is that that is a different kind of Modus Tollens argument, right? Because that appeals to initial events, right? Okay. So it is very important to clarify these points, right? There are actually two distinct kinds of modus tollens argument that I'm offering. And I want to emphasize that any one of them would be sufficient to debunk Oppy's theory, right? So I don't need all two of them to be sound. I only need any one of them to be sound, right? Any one of these two arguments will be sufficient, right, to show that Oppy's theory is false, okay? All right, so let me just briefly explain these two forms again, and then I shall respond to Joe Schmid's objection, okay? So can you show the slide? Can you click? Okay, so what you see here on the screen is the first form, or rather the form that encompasses the first form, right? So if something X begins to exist uncaused, then some other particular things or events, such as Y, which begin to exist, would also begin uncaused, right? So here I'm appealing to events which begin to exist, right? Such as electric field increasing in strength, right? So these are events that we do know happen, and these are later events compared to the initial state of reality, right? These are events that happen around us, which is later than the initial state of the beginning of initial state of reality, right? So here we see the argument that is appealing to events, later events, right? The first form of the modus tollens argument. Okay, now go on. Yeah, and I already explained why this argument is sound, right? Because the premise, and already premise one in particular, because we know that premise two is true, and premise one is true because of the three reasons which I already explained earlier on, right? 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, right? We already talked about this in our previous interview. Okay, now go on to the next slide. Okay, now this is the second form of the modus tollens argument. Okay, and the second form says if space-time block X begins uncaused, right? If our space-time block begins uncaused, what this implies is that the beginning of X will not have causally necessary condition, which makes it the case that only this space-time block, rather than other possible space-time blocks, Y or Z begin uncaused, right? Begin to exist, right? Additionally, any difference between these possibilities, X, Y, and Z, will only be had by them only when they had already begun to exist, right? Moreover, thirdly, there will be no pre-existing entity that makes it incompatible for Y and Z from beginning to exist initially. Now you notice the three reasons, right? These three reasons are kind of parallel, right, to the three reasons which I gave in the previous slide, right? The first reason, right, is the lack of a cause, right? And the second reason is any difference between them. There cannot be any special property, right? That makes it the case that only X rather than others begins. And the third reason is the compatibility condition, right? Which is that there'll be nothing preventing, right, other space-time block from beginning to exist initially. Okay, so so these three reasons jointly imply that there'll be no difference between X, Y, and Z where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned. And so I'm trying to argue that if our space-time block begin uncaused, then other possible space-time block would also begin uncaused, and they other possible space-time block will include those that are very, they may just be adjacent to ours, right? So we will have another universe just beginning just beside ours, right? And so this universe and universe, they will collide, they will expand and crash into each other, right? And they will disrupt each other, right? And our universe will be totally chaotic, right? Total chaos because of the disruption. So this is the second form of the modus tollens argument, which I also presented during the debate. Okay, so notice that these two arguments, these two different forms, these two forms of argument, they are different, right? One concerns later events, whereas this one concerns the initial state. Okay, and explaining this point is important because Schmid's and Oppy's objection concerning modality only apply. Their objection is only relevant, right, for the second form. Right? This form that concerns the initial state, right? Why? Because according to them, their idea of modality is that the initial state is necessary. Remember, they keep saying that, right? So Oppy claimed that because the initial state is necessary, there just cannot be other possible space-time block beginning to exist along ours, alongside ours, right?
Right. He calls this
So that-
a modal branching theory, right?
Yes, that's right. The modal branching theory, right? So his modal branching theory objection is only relevant for this second form of the modus tollens argument. Right? His modal branching, his branching modal theory is not relevant for the first form of the argument which I presented. Can you go back to the previous slide, right? Which shows the first form. Yeah, that's right. This one, right? He cannot use his theory of modality to object to the first form of the argument. Why? Because, as I said earlier on, the first form of the arguments are referring to later events which are actual events, right? So I mentioned just now that electric field increasing in strength around us, these are actual events. So these are not just possible events, right? These are actual events which we know happen, right? So, and I already explained that using the syllogism that there'll be no difference between such actual events and the beginning of our universe, where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, right? And so, because this argument concerns actual events, Oppy cannot use his theory of modality, right, to block these arguments, right? Now, his objection does not rebut the first form of the modus tollens argument. And I already explained just now that any one form will be enough to debunk his theory, right? So and this first form of my argument is already sufficient, right, to debunk his theory. Okay, now what about the second form? Go to the next slide. Okay, the second form of the space-time, the second form. Now, does his theory of modality work against the second form? I mean, it is relevant to the second form, but does it actually rebut the second form of the argument? Now, I have 2 points to say in response. Right? I don't think it works actually, right? And I have 2 reasons for that. Now, my first reason is that Oppy's theory of modality may be okay if the initial state is if the initial state is an immaterial beginningless first cause. But I don't think that his theory of modality is okay if the initial state is a first cause, which is a physical entity with a beginning. Now, why do I say that? Okay, so now I said that his theory. Now, by the way, his theory of modality is controversial, right? He claimed that there are some philosophers who accept this theory, but of course there are also other philosophers who disagree, right? Who reject. So his theory of modality is controversial. And but in any case, I'm happy to say that, well, his theory is okay. May be okay, right? It may be okay if the initial state is an immaterial beginningless first cause. But I don't think it is okay if the initial state is a first cause, which is a physical entity with beginning. Now, why? Okay. Now we need to understand his theory first, right? As I said earlier on, according to his theory of modality, all possible worlds share an initial state of the history of the actual world. And according to their theory, this initial state is necessary, right? So the initial state is necessary, and then the possible worlds branch out from it. Now, I don't think that this theory is okay if the initial state is a first cause, which is a physical entity with a beginning. Why? Because we know, based on observation, that physical entities with beginnings can be arranged differently. So, for example, the arrangement in my house, right, has a beginning, right? When I moved into my house, I brought in tables, I brought in chairs, and I arranged the tables and chairs, right? Now we know that tables and chairs can have different arrangements, right? I can put 3 tables with 3 chairs with 1 table, or 4 chairs with 1 table. You know, they can have different arrangements. Likewise, we also know that atoms and molecules, they can have different arrangements, right? So the arrangement in a water molecule is different from the arrangement in a hydrogen molecule, in a helium molecule, whatever, right? So the different atoms and molecules, they can have different arrangements. So we know that physical entities, we know that based on science and observation, that physical entities with beginnings can be arranged differently. And that is why it is problematic to think that the arrangement of physical entities at the initial state of our physical space-time block is the only possible arrangement, and that there is no other possible arrangement or space-time blocks, which is what they are claiming, right? So I think that what they are claiming is really implausible, given that we know that physical entities can be arranged differently. Whereas an immaterial beginningless first cause doesn't have this problem, right? So now we are comparing theories, right? Which is what Oppy likes to do, right? Oppy likes to compare theories. So let's compare theories, right? We are comparing the theory, Oppy's theory, which is a first cause, which is necessary and has a beginning and is physical, right? With my theory, which is a first cause, which has no beginning and is non-physical, is immaterial, right? Now, I have already explained the problem with his theory, right? The problem with his theory is that we know that physical things with beginnings can be arranged differently, right? Now, what about my theory? Well, my theory doesn't face this problem because we don't have any evidence that immaterial beginningless entity can be arranged differently, right? Have you ever seen an immaterial beginningless entity arranged differently?
No.
No, you have never seen that, right? So you have no evidence, that they could be arranged differently, right? But we have evidence that physical things can be arranged differently, right? And so this is my response, right, to their tu quoque style objection. Right? Remember their favorite objection, the tu quoque style objection, right? They will say that, well, you too, right? You also face the same problem because they think that, well, maybe God could be different, right? And I think if you listen to their review, Alex Malpass mentioned the idea of the quadrinity, right? Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, do you want me to play the clip? I can get that up real quick.
Okay, sure. Yeah, show it a bit, and I will explain it a bit more.
Yeah, because so what they're trying to emphasize is that perhaps God could have been different. So then,
yeah, I thought that was a really fun objection.
Okay, let me see here.
Very funny and interesting. Yes.
Okay. So this was, where did this take place? Oh, okay. So it's at 1748. Okay. 1748.
Well, I mean, I think I tend to agree. The way I was thinking about it, I think it's talking about properties being posterior to their bearers is a useful way of putting it. The way I was thinking about it was that it's like as a conjunction of, thing X exists and thing X has property P. And the thought that Loke was saying is you can't have property P without existing. So, you can't have that conjunct on its own without the conjunction. But then the idea was supposed to be, well, the conjunction together, having property P is never on its own. So it's a conjunction, but the other element in that conjunction is just S existing. And a conjunction can never explain its own conjuncts, right? Like, you want to say, why is A and B true? Well, it's because A is true and it's because B is true, right? That's the order of explanation. You wouldn't say, why is A true? Because A and B is true. And that's obviously getting the order of explanation the wrong way around. So you want, it's just another way of saying the same thing. You have to have this like conjunction of two propositions, one of which says the thing exists and the other one says that it has the property or something. So I think they're just two ways of saying that. And then if you put it like that, then you just make the conjunction.
Hold on, I think that was the wrong clip. 1628, I think, maybe.
Huge idiot, or I don't know how to pronounce it, but the section there he posed.
Yeah, I assume that's how it's meant to be pronounced. Huge idiot.
Yeah. And in the comment section there, he tries to provide this kind of symmetry breaker in terms of beginninglessness, right? And he says that his point is kind of restricted to things with beginnings, right? It's not as though the property would already be had simply in terms of existence, right? The thing would already have to exist. Rather, he's saying that the thing would already have to begin to exist. And so he's kind of trying to restrict his argument to beginnings. Now, in my view, I think the problem with that is that the same reasoning that he employs, right, as applied to beginnings, that same kind of justification would equally apply to God and beginningless things, right? I mean, the posteriority of properties and their ability to kind of demarcate or ground the uncaused from the cause, whether or not it's beginningless or beginning, that kind of justification or reasoning would apply across the board. The posteriority of properties on their bearers applies across the board. And so even if Loke wishes to restrict his argument to beginnings, I think that the justification that he offers for one of his crucial steps in that argument would equally justify a parallel argument against the kind of beginningless uncaused things, or at least privileging God as the single beginningless uncaused thing. And so I don't think his symmetry breaker there works, but I'm wondering what you guys think.
Hold on, I don't, sorry, I can't find the clip properly.
Yeah, this is wrong. I think it's 1748. Can you go to 1748?
Yeah, that's what I played last time. 1748, yeah.
I mean, these are wrong clips. No, because they're actually raising other objections which I address.
Oh, I think I found it.
Okay.
Okay, I'll just say it to the audience because we already explained it. So it's 2440 with Schmid and 2849 with Malpass. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So they claim that it is possible that other timeless beings like a Schmod or Quadrinity rather than a Trinity exist beginninglessly, right? Mm-hmm. So because they know that I'm a Christian, they know that I believe that God is a Trinity, and they are trying to argue that, well, God could have been different also. So maybe God could have been a Quadrinity, right? Having 4 divine persons rather than having 3 persons, right? And my response to that is that, well, we have observation that physical things can be arranged differently. We do not have, we do not know that a Quadrinity or a Schmod is metaphysically possible or not, right? Now they might argue that, well, it is possible because it's conceivable, right? We can conceive of God having 4 persons. However, my response is that what is conceivable is not always possible, right? What is conceivable is not always possible because, as I explained in my subsequent reply to Hugh, to prevent a Quadrinity from existing uncaused beginninglessly in an initially changeless and timeless state, the preventing conditions can be part of the initial changeless and timeless state, which makes such a state incompatible, right, with a Quadrinity or a Schmod existing. So for all we know, it could be that the initial state has some kind of properties which makes it impossible, right, for a Quadrinity existing. I mean, we don't know whether that is true or not, but for them to sustain their objection, they will need to bear the burden of proof, right? For them to raise a tu quoque objection, right, they will need to bear the burden of proof to show that my view suffers from the same problem. So they, not me, they will need to prove that a Quadrinity is possible in the initial state. But I'm arguing that we don't know that because, for all we know, there may be some, who knows, right? There may be some possible in the initial state, that there may be some properties at the initial state which makes it impossible for a Quadrinity to exist, right? And so they haven't proven that a Quadrinity is possible, and therefore their tu quoque style objection fails.
I remember they had the objection that, like, because you were saying that the cause is necessary, right? Or, it's timeless, spaceless, immaterial, changeless before creation, mm-hmm. but also it has the capacity, right, to limit itself, right? So that it's not going to be in flux before the universe begins to exist. And I remember they had an objection to that because they were saying, like, oh, if you're saying that there's a capacity, then you're saying there's a possibility, right? But you said that it has no possibility, but it has the possibility not to make itself possibly different in this way, or something like that. Do you remember that objection?
No, I don't remember. What possibility of what?
Right. So they were trying to say that on one hand, you're saying that prior to creation, God is changeless. But then also you were saying that God has this capacity not to make himself not change, right? So his capacity makes him fixed or changeless. And they were trying to say, well, but if you say that God has this possibility to make himself not change, then, they're trying to say that there's a conflict there. I don't know if you see.
Yes, I'm saying that yes, God has the capacity, he has the freedom to control himself, right? And in fact, precisely given that he has this property, no, it will be impossible, right? It will be metaphysically impossible for it to be otherwise. I mean, given that God chose not to change, he will be initially changeless, right? Given that that's what he chose at the very beginning. So given that that is the case, there is no other metaphysical possibility of him changing, right? So that is precisely my point, right? My point is that the initial state may have some properties that rule out other possibilities, right? So that's why my view doesn't suffer from the same problem as their view, right? Okay, so let me go. Whereas their view suffers the problem because on their view, there's nothing that could have prevented other space-time blocks from beginning to exist uncaused, right? So at this point, right, we need to distinguish between an event and a state, right? So an event, for example, other possible space-time blocks beginning uncaused alongside ours, right? This will be a kind of event. Whereas a state is, say, for example, a beginningless and initially changeless state, right? So my point is that in order to prevent an event, say, for example, another space-time block from beginning, the preventing conditions need to act prior, in some sense of prior, right, to X beginning, right? Otherwise, if X already begun, then it's too late, right, to prevent X from beginning, right? But however, the problem is that on Oppy's theory, there simply isn't a state prior to any, there simply isn't a state prior to the beginning of the initial state of reality for any preventing conditions to do the work of prevention, right? Remember, on Oppy's theory, the initial state of reality begins uncaused, right? And there's nothing prior to it, right? There's not even a timeless state. There's not even a timeless state which exists without the beginning of the universe to prevent anything, right? Since the initial state is the beginning, right? It's the very first state at the beginning, okay? So Oppy's theory doesn't have any kind of preventing conditions that could prevent other possible space-time blocks from beginning. Whereas on my view, God exists timelessly, right, in the initial state. And in this kind of timeless initial changeless state, the preventing conditions can be part of this state, which prevent a quadrinity or a Schmod or whatever else from existing alongside the trinity, right? And that's why my theory is superior to their theory, right? Because my theory can have a kind of preventing conditions which their theories do not have. So this is my first point. Now, my second point is that so my first point is that we know that physical entities, right, can have different arrangements, right? Physical entities like tables and chairs molecules, right, they can have different arrangements. Whereas we don't have any good reasons to think that immaterial entities can have different arrangements. This is my first point. My second point is that many scientists do in fact think that initial conditions of the beginning of our universe could have been different, right? So this point is supported scientifically, and this is related to the so-called fine-tuning problem, right? Which I'm sure Xuan you have heard of, right? The fine-tuning of our universe, right? Now, there's a lot to say about this, right? But because of time, I just want to focus. I don't have time to talk about all the details, but I just want to say that it is unreasonable to say, hey, there is actually no fine-tuning problem. The initial state is just necessary, right? In fact, many scientists would find this view utterly implausible, right? Because given our observation of the universe, which is so highly ordered and so fine-tuned, what is the best explanation for its beginning? Is it something or is it nothing? Right? Oppy is claiming that ultimately it's nothing, right? There's no cause, right? So, but I think most scientists will agree with me that it's unreasonable to think that our universe, with all its billions and billions of stars and the highly ordered laws of physics, ultimately began uncaused. That it just happened this way necessarily, right? Without anything determining it to be like that. I mean, such a conclusion is worse than magic, right? As William Lane Craig says, right? And in the kind of magical events, at least there's still a magician, right? But they're appealing to kind of magic without any magician, which is utterly implausible. And most scientists recognize that, and that it is implausible, and that's the reason why they try to come up with the multiverse hypothesis, for example, in an attempt to address the fine-tuning problem, right? Because they realize that there is a problem, right? And that's precisely why they came up with the fine-tuning, they come up with the multiverse hypothesis. But the problem with the multiverse hypothesis is that even if there are many universes, whatever led to the formation of this multiple universe would itself requires fine-tuning in order to generate so many different kinds of universe, whether is it deterministically or indeterministically, such that ultimately it results in a universe that is fine-tuned. Such a universe, and as Robin Collins argues, anything that produces such a multiverse itself would require significant fine-tuning. So what this implies is that Oppy's initial state would itself needs to be fine-tuned, right? But to say that such a fine-tuned state just begins uncaused is precisely the problem that we start off with, right? It's precisely the fine-tuning problem which we start off with, right? And therefore, Oppy's theory offers no solution, right, to the fine-tuning problem, right? And I think that is just implausible. And therefore, I think it is far more reasonable to conclude that if our universe had a beginning, the highly ordered systems of our universe, together with the highly ordered laws of physics, and the fine-tuning fundamentally ultimately came from something, not from nothing, but from something, a cause which is arguably highly powerful and intelligent. Okay, so there is anyway good reasons to believe that there is a first cause which is highly powerful and intelligent.
All right, where do you want to go next?
Okay, I think we can now. Okay, now we can go to the next point, which actually just now you played a clip by mistake, but actually that's a clip which I would like to talk about next. Actually, so I don't think you need to play again.
Yeah.
But basically, let me remind the audience what that clip was about, right? So just now you played a clip in which Joe Schmid says that appealing to beginninglessness doesn't help to explain why God is uncaused, right? Do you remember that? Right? He said that, right? Okay. So because they think that I appeal to beginninglessness, right? Because I said that things that begins to exist has a cause, and God doesn't require a cause because God is beginninglessness. God is beginningless, right? And they think that appealing to beginninglessness doesn't work, doesn't help, right? Now, my response is to say, firstly, it should be noted that I'm not claiming that anything that exists requires a special property to explain why it exists, because the point that they raise concerns my argument that in order for the initial state to begin uncaused, the initial state must have some special property, right? Remember that? Now, I need to clarify here that I am not claiming that anything that exists requires a special property, right? I mean, this is obviously false, right? Because, for example, my existence does not require a special property to explain why I exist, right? So I did not begin to exist because of any special property, right? Rather, the reason why I begin to exist is because my already existing parents brought me into existence, right? And I'm not required to have a special property, right? I was brought into existence by my already existing parents, right? Now, however, if instead of my already existing parents, I have already existed and have always already existed at all earlier durations and in the initially timeless state, which is what I mean by beginninglessness, then in that case, no parents will be required to explain why I exist, and also no special property will be required as well, right? Because I have already existed, right? So we don't need parents and we don't need special property. So in this case, my beginninglessness is not a special property that explains why I exist. Rather, my beginninglessness is merely a way of describing my already always existence, which also implies that no parents are required, which also implies that I will be uncaused, right? I will be uncaused if I have no beginning, right? And the same reasoning applies to God, right? Because God is supposed to have already always existed at all earlier durations and in the initially timeless state, right? The same reasoning applies. And therefore, no pre-existing causes are required, and he is not required to have any special property. So in this case, his beginninglessness is not a special property that explains why he exists. Rather, his beginninglessness is merely a way of describing his already always existence, which also implies that no cause are required. right? Given that he's also unsustained, right, and also having no beginning, that he will be uncaused. Okay. Now, in my discussion with Hugh Gidiet on his blog, Hugh asked whether beginninglessness itself is a special property. Right? So I claim that God is without beginning, right? So he asked whether beginninglessness itself is a special property. Now, my response is that we need to clarify there's two distinct senses of explanation, right? So the word explain has two different meanings, right? The first meaning is a statement or an account that makes something clear, right? It helps to clarify something, right? And the second meaning is to provide a metaphysical grounding for. So in the case of the initial state of reality beginning uncaused, I was arguing that in order for the initial state to begin uncaused but later events do not, there needs to be a special property that not only makes it clear, but also provides metaphysical grounding for why is it the case that only the initial state, but not later events begin uncaused, right? So I was referring to the second sense, that it needs to provide, there must be a special property that provides a metaphysical grounding. Whereas in the case of God existing beginninglessly, the property of beginninglessness merely makes clear why is it the case that no cause or no special property is needed. By itself, the property of beginninglessness doesn't provide any metaphysical grounding, which S is supposed to provide in the case of the initial state of reality beginning uncaused, right? So what I'm trying to say is that beginninglessness is not a special property in the same sense as what is required, right, to do the work for the beginning of the initial state of reality uncaused, right? So that is my response.
All right. So we're now able to move on to the libertarian freedom section. Is that correct?
Oh yes, that is correct. Good. Yeah. So and let me say something by way of introduction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, so by now, I have already responded, right, to all their objections concerning my Modus Tollens arguments, right? So we are already done with that, right? I already explained why their objections to my Modus Tollens arguments fails. I already explained why their Tukoque style objections fails. And now I'm going to move on. We're going to move on to talk about other issues, right? So during their review, it is quite interesting because we see that there are some disagreements between Schmid, Oppy, and Malpass, actually. I don't know whether the listeners realize. Because as we know, Oppy is trying to argue that the best view is that the first cause has a beginning, right? Whereas Schmid and Malpass, they are willing to consider perhaps an infinite regress or a first cause that has no beginning, right? And at one point, I think Schmid argues that suppose the first cause is beginningless, right? And he claims that there is no need for libertarian freedom, just indeterminacy, right? And so what he's trying to say is that perhaps the first cause is without beginning, and then the first event just indeterministically begin, right, from this first cause without being caused by any libertarian freedom, right? So it is just an indeterministic event, right, that arose from the first cause. Right? And so, so at this point, right, I would like to provide a response, right, to his suggestion. Can you show the slides, please? Okay. All right. Now, I would like to begin my response by first citing astrophysicists Aguirre and Cajallas. Now, they mentioned a problem which is worth thinking about. Right? So they say that it's very difficult to devise a system, especially a quantum one, that does nothing forever and then just evolves. Because a truly stationary state would just last forever, will never evolve, right? whereas one with any instability will not endure for an indefinite time. Okay. So, and this point is relevant, right, to Schmid's suggestion, because Schmid is trying to say that there is a first cause which is beginningless, right? Aguirre is trying to say that if it's beginningless and stationary, right, initially changeless, it will just remain so. Right? It will never evolve, right? That is the problem. Now, with regards to this quotation from Aguirre, I need to clarify that Aguirre was arguing against a particular model called the emergent universe model, the emergent universe scenario. However, his point is still relevant because even though he is arguing against a particular model, but his point is that a beginningless state, right, would have the same, would have this problem. And at this point in time, we also need to clarify, that there are two different kinds of initial there are two different possible there are two different possible beginningless states, right? So one possibility is something is beginningless if, say, for example, it is infinite in time in the past, right? And so that is one possibility which Oppy was thinking about. Whereas another possible beginningless state will be a timeless state, right, which I argue for, right, in my response to Oppy. Now, Aguirre is making a point about a beginningless state in time, right? So some people may object to me by saying that, well, now you are misusing Aguirre because he is talking about a state that is beginningless in time, whereas you are talking about a state that is beginningless in timelessness, right? So some people might object to me by saying that, I shouldn't cite him, right? Because we are talking about different things. Now, my response is that even though we are talking about different things, yet nevertheless, there is still a point of commonality, which is in both cases, we are still talking about beginninglessness, right? Even though there are different kinds of beginninglessness, and yet the point I'm making concerns beginninglessness. And by beginninglessness, what I mean is that it is not having any limits in the earlier than direction, right? Not having any limits in the earlier than direction, right? Not having any temporal boundary, right? So this could be either a timeless state or an infinite regress, right? So a timeless state is different from an infinite regress, but in both cases, there is no limits, right, in the earlier than direction, right? It's infinite. There's just no finite limits in the earlier than direction, and this is the point which I want to hold on to, right? Which I'm going to make use for my arguments in response to Schmid, right? And this is the point of relevance, right, which I want to emphasize, and I'm going to explain this further later, right? But before that, move on to the next slide, please. So another astrophysicist, Chan Man Ho, who is my friend in Hong Kong, now he explains in a stable state, the decay lifetime will be infinite. Now, what is a decay lifetime, right? So we know that radioactive decay, for example, right, is often cited as a kind of indeterministic event, right? Remember, Schmid was appealing, right, to indeterministic, right? He's appealing to indeterminacy, right? So indeterminacy in the literature, this is often used to refer to one of two kinds of events. So one is quantum events, right, such as radioactive decay, right? And the other kind of event is libertarian freedom, right? Libertarian freedom, right? So these are two different kinds of indeterministic events. Now, so Schmid rejects libertarian freedom, right? He claimed that it will be some kind of indeterministic event. So let's consider quantum event, right? Now, by the way, it is still debatable whether quantum events are truly indeterministic or not. As I said in my previous interview, there are different interpretations of quantum physics, right? Some are deterministic, such as the Bohm pilot wave model, but there are also other interpretations which are indeterministic. Now, which one is correct? Scientists still do not know yet, right? But let's grant them the benefit of the doubt, right? So let's suppose that quantum events are indeterministic. Would it solve the problem? Well, no. Why? Because as Chan explains, in a stable state, the decay lifetime will be infinite without any external cause. This state will just last forever. However, and so it will just remain changeless, right? It wouldn't just have some kind of indeterministic event just beginning from it, right? It will just remain stable forever, right? With no change at all, forever and ever. However, if it is in an unstable state, the initial state will change to other states in a finite time. So it won't be infinite in the past. I mean, it won't be without any limits, right? In the earlier direction. That's the point I want to emphasize, right? Because the decay lifetime will be finite, right? It will be limited, and therefore, if the initial state of our universe is a stable state, no Big Bang would occur because the state will exist forever without the Big Bang. Since we have the Big Bang based on observation, our initial state must not be a stable state. But if it's an unstable state, then the Big Bang will occur, but the time for this initial state must be finite. This implies a beginning must exist, right? And so what this means is that if Schmid wants to appeal to this theory, he would have to say that the first cause would have a beginning, right? But then he would have to face the objection of my Modus Tollens argument, which applies to Oppy's theory, would also apply to Schmid's theory, right? And so my Modus Tollens argument would refute Schmid's theory, right, if that were the case. And so he has to say that the first cause has no beginning. But then if the first cause has no beginning and is initially changeless, then and if it has no free will, no libertarian freedom, then it will just remain changeless forever, right? And we won't have the Big Bang, right? So either way, his theory fails, right? So go to the next slide. Okay, so my point is this, right? If the first cause is impersonal without libertarian freedom, and an event just arose indeterministically from it, right? So if there is a non-finite probability of an event arising from the initial state of such a first cause, this will imply that the initial state is unstable, right? It has a likelihood of changing with the beginning of the first event. And this instability implies that the first cause would exist in the initial state for only a finite duration, right, rather than beginninglessly, unlimitedly, right, initially changelessly, right? And so, you know, therefore his Schmid's view doesn't work, because if something exists beginninglessly and changelessly, then it is unlimitedly stable. There will be no likelihood, no propensity, no tendency, no disposition for change, unless it has free will, right? Because if there's no free will, then there's no freedom to change, right? And so in order to avoid this problem, the first cause must have libertarian freedom. It must have the power to control itself, that it can control itself such that it doesn't change in an unlimited way initially, and then freely bring about, and freely brought about the first event, right? Which is the two capacities that I explained previously, right? And so this shows that the first cause must have libertarian freedom. Now, Graham Oppy chip in and say that, well, libertarian freedom just is a species of indeterminacy. My response is, yes, it is a species of indeterminacy, but it's a more specific species, right? It's the only species of indeterminacy which can do the work of explaining why is it the case that the first cause is beginningless, whereas the first event has a beginning, right? So we need libertarian freedom. I mean, this is the only possible explanation, right, to explain why this is the case, right? And so Schmid's objection fails, and the first cause has libertarian freedom.
All right. Did you have more?
So far?
Yeah. Did you have more to say about Oppy's objection?
Well, I have already responded to his objection, but I do have more to say about what some other scientists, right, have said about this, because during the discussion on YouTube, right, on the YouTube comments, there are some people who have raised the objection that, you know, some people have claimed that some scientists have tried to argue that time could have emerged from timelessness. Have you heard of this theory before, Swan?
No, I don't. I have not. Yeah.
Well, this is quite a popular theory that has been circulating around on YouTube comments. Right? Some people have claimed that about emergent time, right? How time could emerge, right, from timelessness. Now, my response is that, firstly, all the scientists who claim this, you know, they all admit that their views are tentative, because given that we do not have a well-established theory of quantum gravity, right? And whereas my argument is not tentative, because my argument is based on the analysis of the necessary conditions for an event to begin from a beginningless and initially changeless first cause. Right? So my argument is based on the necessary conditions, right? And my argument is based on what is analytically true, right? And no, it's just like 2 + 2 = 4, right? Analytically true, right? So there's no way that such a claim can be refuted, right? So what I'm trying to say is that my conclusion cannot be refuted, whereas those what the other scientists were saying, what they are saying is not established at all, because they don't have any good, because they currently do not have any well-established theory of quantum gravity. That's my first point. And my second point is that in any case, I don't think they are even objecting to what I'm saying, because when those scientists talk about emergent time, what they are trying to talk about is actually the measurement of time. Right? They are talking about when they talk about, so they are not actually talking about time itself, but they're actually talking about the measurement of time, right? The time metric, how this emerged, right? So whereas I'm talking about time itself, right? How did the first event begin, right? And on the relational view of time, that will be the beginning of time, right? More importantly, I do not see those scientists address the issue of a beginningless and initially changeless or eventless state, as it is defined in the context of the Kalam cosmological arguments. So in other words, those scientists, when they claim that time emerged from timelessness, they're actually talking about another problem. They're talking about measurement of time, and they are not talking about how the first event began to exist from initially changeless first cause. They are not talking about that, and therefore, what they are talking about does not block the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument that there exists a first cause which is initially changeless and has libertarian freedom, right? And so that is the point of clarification I would like to make.
All right, that sounds good. So let's see here. The next objection that we have is that talking about when Oppy got angry during the debate. So
yeah.
So I don't think we have to play the clip, but basically Oppy said, he said he got angry because he felt like Loke didn't understand his point concerning causal priority and temporal priority. Can you reiterate what that point was and what you think about Oppy's response?
Yeah, towards the end of that review, they say that, well, Oppy got angry. Why? And Oppy tried to say, well, because Andrew Loke doesn't seem to understand what I was talking about, because I was talking about causal priority and not temporal priority. Now, however, if you go back and listen carefully to that part of the debate, right, you will see that I struggle to understand, because Oppy was using very confusing terms, right? Oppy was using the term before, and if you check the dictionary, before means during the period of time preceding a particular event or time, right? So before is a word that has a temporal connotation, right? It means temporal priority, right? And yet Oppy is saying, I'm not talking about temporal priority. No, he says he's not talking about temporal priority, and yet he used a word which implies temporal priority, right? Which makes it so confusing, right? And also he used the word duration, he used causal duration, right? But the word duration means the time during which something continues, right? Which again is a temporal term, right? I mean, all these terms do not make sense in the absence of time dimension, right? So the problem is, I think, is not because I don't understand, but I think the problem at the end of the day, I think the problem is with him misunderstanding what timelessness means, right? And using all these confusing terms, right? Which yeah. So I think that is the problem.
When he kind of, I don't want to, he says he regrets it, but when he kind of lashed out or kind of got frustrated, right? How did you react, or what was going through your mind when he did that? Or did you even notice it?
Well, that's a good question. Now, I think like a lot of people, we all think that Graham Oppy is such a smart guy, right? So when he lashed out, I thought, well, maybe I missed something, right? Maybe I was, and so I apologized. I said I'm sorry, right? And then he go on and talk, and then I said, but then hey, you just used the word before again, right? But I thought you said there's no temporal priority, right? I mean, shouldn't you use the word instead of before? He should have used the word prior, right? I mean, that's the technical term that's used in the academic literature, right? So he said that God is causally prior, right? right? But not temporary prior, right? We should use the word.
Yeah.
We should use the word prior, which is which doesn't necessarily imply temporality, because prior can refer to priority of order, for example, right? Order of being, for example, right? No, but Oppy is using terms which are not so precise and carries a different connotation, right? The temporal connotation, which makes it so confusing. And that's why I was utterly confused, because I didn't expect him to be, to be mistaken about this, and yet he used such confusing terms. So that made me extra confused.
Right. So now I guess we can move on to I think the last thing that you have on the docket to talk about, which is Oppy, when he talks about why he believes there's a beginning of the universe. So I know that there's a point that you want to make by talking about this. So what's the point of interest? Because I know that Malpass, right, he disagrees with Oppy, that there needs to be like a beginning of the universe, right? And in your past engagements, he's mentioned objections to this effect. So can you talk to us about this point here in the debate or in the review?
Okay, so Graham thinks that he believes that the universe has a beginning because he thinks that this is a simpler view. He thinks that the view of infinite regress, right, is more complicated, right? Now, I think that infinite regress is not only more complicated. I think an infinite regress results in contradiction, violation of metaphysical necessity, or vicious regress, right? So I briefly mentioned this during our first interviews where I explained there are a number of arguments, right, against an infinite regress, right? Now, on this point, again, I mentioned just now, I think Malpass seems to disagree with Oppy because, as I said, Malpass seems to think that because Oppy's favorite theory accepts a first cause, right? Whereas Malpass does not seem to accept a first cause. Right? Now, Malpass and I have debated about the first cause in the previous debate on Justin Briley's Premier Christianity channel, right? So for those of you who are interested, you all can check out my earlier debates with Malpass. Now, basically, we debated the argument from the viciousness of dependence regress, right? Remember this argument which we discussed during our first interview?
Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
The one that I used, the train car analogy, right? So that argument shows that in order to prevent a vicious regress, there needs to be a first cause which is independent and always existed. And during my debate with Malpass, he raised the objection using the static theory of time. He claimed that, okay, you say that, Andrew Loke, you say that there must be a first cause that always exists, right? But according to the static theory of time, I always exist. Say, for example, in the year 2020, right now, I always tenselessly exist, right, in the year 2020. I mean, that's the tenseless theory of time, right? And on the tenseless theory of time, there's no now actually. I mean, the presentness, right, is just the special property of presentness is just an illusion on the static theory of time, right? So on the static theory of time, I just tenselessly exist, right, in the year 2020. Now, however, Malpass did not respond to my objection. Malpass did not reply to my response to him that even if the tenseless theory of time is true, it is still the case that later events are dependent on earlier events. So, for example, even if the tenseless static theory of time is true, and I exist tenselessly, I begin to exist tenselessly in 1975. I was born in that year, right? So that event is still dependent on earlier events. Right? Say, for example, the beginning of existence of my parents prior to 1975. Why? Because if my parents did not exist prior to 1975, I would not have begun to exist in 1975, right? So, so later events are still dependent on earlier events, even on the static theory of time. And on this point, it should be noted that there are two different senses of always exists, right? And I think Malpass commits the fallacy of equivocation, because the word always exists can mean two different things, right? It can mean, firstly, having no beginning and therefore doesn't require a cause. That was what I mean when I say the first cause always exists. Right? And there's a second sense of always exists, which is having a beginning, but it's a tenseless fact at a particular duration, right? So my argument is referring to the first sense. I'm arguing that there must be a first, in order to terminate the infinite vicious regress, in order to prevent a vicious regress, there must be a first cause that always exists in the sense of having no beginning, right? Whereas he is talking about always exists in the sense of having a beginning, right? And so he is actually talking about a different sense of always exists, which missed the point of my argument. Right? Because as I said, on his view, having a beginning, such events that have beginning would still be such events would still be dependent on earlier events, right? And therefore does not block my arguments. And therefore, Malpass' objection fails because it commits the fallacy of equivocation.
Right.
And therefore, my argument stands, and it implies that there's a first cause. And
I think you've emphasized throughout that when we talk about, you're saying that the history and the prior causes, right, are finite. So if you want to catch that in terms of temporal, the temporal background behind an effect, or if you want to cash it out in terms of, the series of causes before the effect or whatever, it all is the same to you, basically.
Sorry, what is the same?
So both are finite in terms of like the number that precedes them. So for instance, like you're saying that, this is like more a response to Oppy, right? But like, dividing between temporal priority and like ontological priority, they both require a first cause in some sense. So does that make sense? So
no, can you explain more, because I'm missing what you're trying to say.
Right. So I remembered like you talked about, for instance, okay, so Malpass says that, so he equivocates between having no beginning and therefore doesn't require a cause, and having a beginning but a tenseless fact at a particular duration, right? So if you modify the definition of time, then you still have to deal with the causal history, or the prior causes that are finite in nature. But if so the point is that still, like, even if you change the definition of time, then you still have to deal with the causal background, right?
Yeah, that's right. There must be a first cause.
Right. So yeah, sorry about that. Like, what is it? It's yeah,
that's right. So in any way, Oppy and I agree that there's a first cause, right? Malpass disagree, but I think Malpass is wrong, right? And so me and Oppy, we had more agreement actually, right? Me and Oppy agree that there's a first cause. The main difference between me and Oppy is whether the first cause has a beginning or not, right? And so and therefore, we need to go back, right, to comparing the two theories again, right? So this is the last slide that I'll talk about, right? And this slide was taken from Elephant Philosophy. He make a review, right? A very interesting review of my discussion with Oppy. And so on Oppy's theory, Oppy claimed that his theory is simpler, right? However, I argue that this simplicity, this virtue, is outweighed, is overridden by the contradiction, which is demonstrated by my Modus Tollens arguments, right? As well as the sheer implausibility of suggesting something so complicated, so highly ordered, so fine-tuned as our space-time block, just beginning to exist uncaused, which, as I said earlier on, is like a magical event. In fact, it's worse than a magical event, because in a magical event, there is still at least a magician, right? But on Oppy's view, if you look at the left slide, if you look at the left side of the PowerPoint, right, on his view, this huge, highly organized space-time block just begin to exist, right, without any cause at all, right? So this is like magic, right, or worse than magic, right, which at least has a magician. Whereas my view doesn't entail any contradiction and is far more plausible. But even so, but what I'm trying to say is that even without my Modus Tollens arguments, right, even without my Modus Tollens argument, if you hold my feet to the fire, right, to use Oppy's favorite phrase, right, I would still have chosen, right, to believe on the right side, right, that there is at least eternally existing magician, right, God, who brought about the beginning of the universe, right. So even on my modus tollens argument, I still think that it is more plausible to think that if the universe began to exist, it has a cause, right? But with my modus tollens argument, I think the case is even stronger, right? I think it's shown that Oppy's view is demonstrably false, right? Because I already explained before that a theory cannot be true if it entails a contradiction, right? And my modus tollens argument shows that a theory that entails a contradiction cannot be true, even if it's simpler, right? So Oppy's theory is simpler, yes, but it entails a contradiction, as demonstrated by my modus tollens arguments, and therefore his theory is false. Period. Right? So in their objection, in their review, Oppy, Malpass, and Schmid, they have offered various objections to the modus tollens argument and also to the Kalam, and I have shown that their objections fail, and therefore my modus tollens argument actually remains intact, and so does the Kalam. Therefore, the conclusion that there's a creator of the universe stands.